Since this historic moment, the almost completely successful test of the SN8, just about every space enthusiast, or the vast majority of them anyway, regard this as being our method of getting to the red planet. It's the Starship or bust. But it could be argued that in spite of its innovation, the Starship is just using raw power to get to the red planet, as many engines and as much fuel as possible in order to overcome Earth's gravity and get to our destination come hell or high water. But is this the only method? Well, there's a certain famous astronaut named Buzz Aldrin, whom we should all know by sight, who might argue no. Way back in 1985, he came up with an idea, or rather modified an existing idea, called a Mars Cycler. And the vessel is designed to carry cargo and passengers to and from the red planet on an ongoing basis. Not landing, not stopping, but just traveling constantly, nonstop between the two planets. And although it uses propellant in the initial stages, from then on, it uses something that the Voyagers used, and that's gravitational slingshots. So instead of using nuclear power, instead of using light, instead of using all of these other alternative forms of energy that I've talked about for propulsion, it simply uses gravity to increase its delta V. And the idea is both innovative and fascinating. But is it something that's better than the Starship? Or could it be used in conjunction with it? Well, the answer to the second question is a definite yes, and I would like to explain exactly how this might be accomplished, and both Buzz Aldrin and Elon Musk's dreams could be realized all at once. So let's find out how right now. Good evening, and welcome to another episode of the Angry Astronaut. So, as we saw in the little intro, what about the possibility of going to Mars without using propellant, or at least not a lot of propellant? Instead of using the sun, as I have often advocated, instead of using nuclear power or anything else that obviously uses propellant, instead, we use gravity. And this may be something that seems absurd that, sure, we've used flybys on planets like Jupiter and that sort of thing for the Voyager spacecraft to increase their speed to allow them to reach their objectives more quickly. But to do this with human transportation seems impossible. And you're right, in terms of just using pure gravity, it is impossible. However, back in 1985, when Elon Musk was a teenager, Buzz Aldrin came up with the idea of a Mars cycler, and it uses slingshots from the various planets in the inner solar system to increase the delta V of the rocket concerned, the Mars cycler as it is called, in order to reduce the amount of propellant, the amount of fuel that has to be used in order to transport human beings from Earth to Mars, and also from Earth to Phobos, actually. That's part of the plan as well. And the less propellant you have to use, the more you can carry on the ship, and also the more radiation shielding you can have. If you don't have to carry as much propellant, it opens up so many alternatives. And like I said, he came up with this idea way back in '85. And obviously, once again, nothing has been done about it. And of course, this tends to piss me off. But is there a way that we could integrate this with the Starship? Because the plan as it is, even though it talks about a permanent presence on the red planet, it's not very ambitious in terms of the numbers of people. Elon Musk wouldn't like it because it wouldn't create a colony of 1 million people. Is there a way that we could integrate large numbers of starships into this whole plan in order to transport larger numbers of people and larger numbers of cargo to create a second home for the human species? Well, I've actually consulted with a lot of folks on my team who happen to be physicists and engineers, and yes, indeed, there is a way to do it. How? Well, we're going to talk about that right now. First of all, the Mars Cycler must be constructed in orbit. Therefore, the Starship would be invaluable in that case, being able to carry a whole lot more cargo to low Earth orbit than any other vehicle. Now, the design is very straightforward. First of all, you just need the propulsion and fuel in order to carry you into Mars insertion, and no further than that. To put this in terms of delta V requirements, all you would need is to go from here to here. And you simply use gravity to do the rest. And by the way, this is less delta V than would be required to take off from Mars to low Mars orbit, a planet with 1/3 our gravity. So we're not talking about a lot of delta V here or a lot of propulsion. And by the way, it's also less delta V than it requires to get from low Earth orbit to lunar orbit, which is a tiny distance delta V wise, and yet this is still less. So the rest of this simple vessel is comprised of solar panels for the solar electric propulsion and also for power for the ship, crew transfer vehicles to both bring the passengers to the ship and also to land on the Martian surface, and finally inflatable habitation units based on the Bigelow B330. And yes, I know they're out of business, but the technology still exists. Now, the B330 is an ideal solution for this design because it's inflatable, it's lightweight, and it can contain 330 cubic meters per inflatable habitat, hence the name. So we're talking about 2/3 of the total volume of the Starship's fairing. But this doesn't have to be all of the cargo that we're talking about or living space. But before we start talking any more about the ship's design or how the Starship might be integrated in with it, we have to answer the question, what's the damn point? Well, let's have a look. The ship launches from Earth, rendezvous with Mars, picking up additional speed because of a gravitational slingshot effect. The return to Earth is a very, very long process, but when it does return to Earth, it picks up even more speed from the gravity in low Earth orbit. At that point, when it's at closest approach to Mars, at least has a launch window in order to be able to rendezvous, it has even more delta V. And so, using the very small amount of propellant required to get the ship from low Earth orbit into Mars insertion, you have a vehicle that will perpetually travel between Mars and Earth and vice versa, utilizing only the gravity of the two planets and, by the way, the gravity of the Sun as well in order to maintain its course. Now, you'd need a small amount of propellant in order to make minor course corrections, but the point is that you're traveling to and from Mars and Earth without having to use any fuel. and that allows you to carry so much more cargo, so much more in the way of passengers, and a lot more radiation shielding. But the most dangerous part of this system is something called a hyperbolic rendezvous, where a taxi or a ship from Earth has to rendezvous with a cycler, which is traveling very, very fast, tens of thousands of kilometers per hour, as it does its flyby in order to transfer the crew or the cargo from Earth to the cycler before it starts hurtling its way back towards Mars. You get one shot at this, and if you miss, you go plunging out into interstellar space, never to return. So you definitely want to use cargo for the first few times of using the cycler, but once you have the process down, the advantages would far outweigh the risks. For example, since you didn't have to use any propulsion in order to get to Mars after your first flyby, that is, then the ships on board, the landers, would not have to use any of their propellant to get to Mars. Instead, that propellant could be reserved to orbit, to rendezvous with Phobos, or for a powered landing on the Martian surface. A lot of options and a lot more room for safety for the crew. And speaking of Phobos, researchers at the University of Purdue, who are currently helping Buzz Aldrin with his current concept, are big advocates of a base on Phobos before we land on Mars. Yes, I'm not the only one who's enthusiastic about Mars Base Alpha. Since a lander attached to the cycler would not have to use any of its fuel in order to get to Mars, only to rendezvous with a cycler, it would have enough surplus fuel to decelerate and land on Phobos. Not an easy task, of course, because of Phobos' low gravity, but the advantages are many-fold. First of all, it's a huge source of water and also of fuel, but also we can control robots in real time from Phobos. What this means is all these 3D printed designs that I've shown you in the past for habitats on Mars could be controlled in real time from the Martian satellite, which would be a lot easier than the 4 to 15 minutes worth of lag time from Earth. Therefore, if any problems came up while constructing these structures, or anything else on Mars constructed by a robot, Phobos would be the solution. So among its many other advantages, the Mars Cycler would also give us easier access to Phobos, and therefore an easier way for us to build structures on Mars and create staging for an eventual human presence. On top of that, trying to land on Mars in the middle of one of its electrostatically charged dust storms would not be a wise idea, so you could wait out the storm on Phobos and land after the storm cleared. So many advantages to building a base on this moon, and the cycler would make it so much easier. And finally, there are few views in the solar system that would be as spectacular as the one that you would get from Mars Base Alpha. But what about the Starship? I mean, how do we integrate that into this cycler and make it useful and make it better? Well, one obvious solution would be to use the Starship as your taxi, essentially, for the hyperbolic rendezvous. Fly it into low Earth orbit, refuel it, and use the Starship's engines to generate the delta V necessary to rendezvous with the cycler. Therefore, you would have not only the cycler's cargo capacity and volume, but the Starship's as well. A lot more space, plus the Starship would have additional fuel left over to enter orbit, rendezvous with Phobos, or perform a powered landing on Mars. However, the one drawback to this scenario would be that the cycler would be pulling a lot of dead weight. The Starship would have mostly empty fuel tanks, a lot of engines that would never really be used again or very seldom used anyway, and it just seems to be kind of overkill given the amount of cargo space and volume that the Cycler already has. However, there is yet another solution that involves the Starship and also a plan called Mars Direct 3.0, something that you've probably gotten kind of familiar with, and I have linked in the description. It involves the Starship refueling in low Earth orbit, same old plan, and then using the Starship in order to deliver a very special package to the Mars Cycler once you carry out the necessary rendezvous. And I think a lot of you can guess what I have in mind here, and that, of course, is the mini Starship. And since the mini Starship would not require any propellant whatsoever in order to get to Mars, because the Cycler would take care of that, it could use its propellant for a powered landing or for extra cargo. Because even though there's a huge difference in size between these two ships, most of that is because the Starship has huge fuel tanks and engines. The mini Starship could be used for crew, cargo, and one engine and not a lot of fuel, because the Cycler could take care of all of that for it. And the safety features of Mars Direct 3.0 would also be there, because if the hyperbolic rendezvous didn't work out for some reason, in the early stages the mini Starship could carry enough fuel in order to get to Mars on its own, or to perform an abort if necessary. So to build your million-person colony on Mars, you wouldn't need 1,000 starships. Instead, only enough starships to resupply cyclers, maybe 1,000 cyclers for that matter, coming by every few years to continue to supply Mars. And it probably wouldn't need to be 1,000, it could be 100 or so, going every few years until the colony was built. So to review, Buzz Aldrin's solution, who, by the way, has a degree in astronautics from MIT, does not involve getting to Mars quickly, but rather getting to Mars with a minimum amount of propellant, allowing for the larger amount of cargo and radiation protection, and propellant for a safe landing or an orbital entry. And this is carried out through a remarkably innovative orbital path that intersects with Earth and Mars perpetually until the end of time, essentially, or as long as humanity should need it. All very compelling, but is this the best way to do it? Well, one thing I don't like about Mr. Aldrin's idea is that although it endorses the notion of a permanent human presence on Mars, it's only for about 60 to 65 people, a research station, and that's essentially it. It doesn't believe, or at least embrace, the idea of humans colonizing Mars in large numbers, and that I find to be unacceptable. We need to colonize Mars. Our civilization will not survive if we remain stranded on this planet. But if we incorporate the Starship and Elon Musk's vision into Buzz Aldrin's vision, it's entirely possible that we might have a winning combination here. Only time will tell. Now, of course, there are a number of problems with this plan, foremost of which is the longer transit time. I mean, we're not talking about 5 or 6 months here, or 2 months or so with some of the alternate propulsion methods that I've talked about in the past. However, a longer transit time is not as big of an issue if you have more radiation shielding. However, the one place where it is a big deal is the longer period of time in microgravity, and therefore the longer period of time that humans would need to adjust to the one-third gravity of Mars. It wouldn't be as extreme as coming back to Earth, but still it would be a longer adjustment time, and there's some of a negative aspect to that. Also, the cycler plan as it stands, in my opinion, is just too conservative. Yes, it does talk about a permanent presence on the red planet, but it only talks about a few dozen people, a research station, treating Mars as if it were Antarctica. As a matter of fact, not even as ambitious as our research stations on Antarctica. It really is assuming that we humans cannot make Mars our permanent home. And in my opinion, that simply isn't true. We have to dismiss these ideas that we have to go to Mars and then return because we humans simply cannot handle long term stays or staying the rest of our life on Mars, that we're just not going to be able to handle it. And I feel that if our species is to survive, then we're going to have to adjust to this. We're going to have to learn to live on other planets, regardless of whether we have to adjust to different gravitational environments, living in environmental suits on a regular basis, whatever we have to adjust to. We need to do this because the 60 some people that they're talking about in Buzz Aldrin's Cycler program is not enough of a genetic diversity to ensure the survival of the human race. It won't work for a second home for the human species. It will work in terms of a permanent presence, but that's about it. A scientific research station, like I said. So we need to introduce things like the Starship, larger craft with more, capacity, more cargo capacity, capable of carrying more passengers, and therefore more ambitious settlements on the surface as well. But all of this can be accomplished with the cycler system, and accomplished very well because it's an ongoing system that is constantly bringing cargo, constantly bringing new settlers to the red planet on a regular basis, continuing to build up the population bit by bit. Or hell, if we build a lot of cyclers, we could start doing this a lot more rapidly. It really depends on how ambitious we want to become. Is this something that Elon Musk would be likely to go for? Probably not. At least not initially. It really depends on whether or not his Starship plan, as it is successful. However, if it isn't, if his first few attempts crash, that sort of thing, and he determines that landing people using the Starship alone is not going to be a safe alternative, and he needs to have a more complicated or just simply a more comprehensive approach to the problem, then he may start looking at something like this. And I personally think that Buzz Aldrin's idea, with a certain number of modifications, is a very good idea to set up a colony on the red planet. We are getting so close to 40,000 subscribers at a rate that I never imagined. I have one video that has over 250,000 views now. It's blowing my mind. Thank you. Thank you so much for your support. I really appreciate it. If you want to continue to support content like this, it's all in the description. You know how to do it, and help me blow this mug to bits. And then we'll go from 40,000 subscribers to 50,000 and beyond that as we take this channel to the next level. So, until we're ready to set off for the red planet in whatever solution we decide to use, whether it be the Starship as it is, or Buzz Aldrin's idea, or something else, but let it be something, and let it be soon. I urge all of you to stay angry about space.